Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our presenters. So today joining us, we have Erin Peterson, Associate Director for Work Plus at the Center for Career Readiness and Life Skills, and Kristen Soprano, Assistant Director for Work Plus at the Center for Career Readiness and Life Skills. I will turn it over to the both of you for this wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So, yeah, my name's Aaron. I work at the Center for Career Readiness and Life Skills. Kristen and I are both involved in a pretty new initiative at UConn, which is called Work Plus. Talk a little bit about what Work Plus is. But Work Plus is essentially transforming student employment, so students who work on campus, into more of an internship-like feel. We do this for a number of reasons, but one of our key goals is really to foster personal and career growth through meaningful engagement. So we're doing things like helping supervisors become better supervisors and better mentors for their student employees, and helping student employees align what they're learning in their student employment experience with some of their future goals and aspirations, whether that be working after they graduate or going to graduate school. We help them with all of that through meaningful professional development opportunities that they receive as part of their working on campus. So that's a little bit about what Work Plus is. And we have a number of supervisors and students that are involved in this. We're in an initial pilot phase this year. Just to give you some background, we've got about 240 students who are participating in this year, and about 40 direct supervisors and 60 supervisors altogether who are kind of helping us shape this program. So that's a little bit about what Work Plus is and how Chris and I are involved. So today we're going to talk a little bit about enhancing leadership skills, but I'd like you to take just a moment, and if you could put this in the chat, that would be really helpful. But think about a great supervisor or a great mentor that you've had along the way in your career. And what are some of those qualities that stand out to you as things that you remember being really excellent about them as a leader or a mentor? And just a reminder, if your chat is not selected on everyone and it just says hosts and panelists, please change that to everyone so that we can see kind of what people are saying. Okay, great. Yeah, so things are coming in as you can see here. So feedback, communication, yep. Yeah, wonderful. Wonderful. Great to see some familiar names on here. All right, so let's talk a little, and thank you so much. You can continue to put these in here, but let's talk a little bit about some leadership styles that it kind of helps to define a little bit about what some different leadership styles are. Not all of these styles work for every organization. Obviously, some work better for some teams and some work better for other teams. But as I kind of go through and define each one of these, I want you to think about what's your leadership style? Where does it mostly fall? What would you ideally like to be as a leader? And also think about some, maybe your boss or people that you've reported to, and think about those leadership styles and how it worked or works for you as an employee. So we'll kind of start in the top left and talk a little bit about the leadership style that we call servant. And this really puts the employees first. And so the supervisor kind of falls back and looks for opportunities to develop their employees for success. So that's kind of the servant leadership style. Bureaucratic, this is one that is pretty by the book. There's not a lot of room for flexibility in a bureaucratic leadership style. Typically, you can identify these as following a chain of command, so the authority resides at the top and flows downward. A lot of formal titles tend to happen in bureaucratic leadership styles. Coaching, that's all about harmonizing. So supervisor usually looks for ways to play on individual employee strengths and develop strategies for success around these strengths. Transformational leaders, they're usually pushing their employees to set the bar higher and reach new heights. This can, in fact, yield high returns and growth rates for an organization, but there's some downsides to that too. If you're not careful, this can lead to losing sight of what your baseline is and cause new employees, especially, to struggle as they're trying to learn. Laissez-faire, this is kind of leaving the decision-making to the individual employees. So this can be empowering for employees and make them feel trusted, but it does require a lot of checks and balances. This can become feel disorganized pretty quickly. An autocratic leader makes all the decisions on their own and holds all authority and responsibility. So this can be useful in work environments that require quick and confident decisions, but the downside is it can generate a hostile, resentful work environment. So you got to be careful sometimes with that one. A democratic leader, they decide on what the best course of action is based on team input. So this generally generates a collaborative and constructive work environment. And finally, the transactional leader, they create a tone of agreement based on very specific responsibilities. So performance is measured and rewarded based on successful completion or not. So this type of style is pretty rigid, doesn't leave much room for innovation or growth. So think about kind of what you feel the ideal leader is in your area, and what you strive to do, and kind of where you fall in this. Now, there's a lot of ways you can assess, what your leadership style is. There's DISC and Strengths Finder and all those types of assessments. Most of these assessments, as you probably are aware, require some cost. They might require a membership to something or some interpretive results, costs involved. If you've never taken the Myers-Briggs type indicator, not necessarily a leadership style uh, assessment, but can assess your personality in a couple of different ways. This 16personalities.com, that will actually allow you to take the Myers-Briggs type assessment for free. And that can give you some insights as far as how your personality might align with these different leadership styles. And I'll turn it over to Chris.
Thanks, Erin. So I'm going to go ahead and start to shift a little bit more into the aspect of, really cultivating those teams, building those productive and high performing teams based off of how you're implementing your chosen leadership style. So first is just kind of thinking a little bit about what is the recipe for that cohesive team, right? How do I strive for that? How do I do that? I'm a huge fan of the movie Remember the Titans. So every time, if you've never seen it, I highly recommend you watch it. It's a fantastic movie. Um, but so every time I start talking about leadership and all that idea, I always think of this scene between two of the main characters in the movie, and a great quote that one of them says to the other, "Attitude reflects leadership, Captain." So really kind of important to think about when we're thinking about creating a healthy team. It's not just the ingredients that go into that healthy team; it's also how we as the leaders are exemplifying those same practices that we're essentially preaching. So first, kind of really thinking about the idea of, trusted leadership. Employees really want to know that they're essentially working for and having the back of somebody who has theirs, right? And knowing that this person, in the forefront or maybe in the back front, depending upon the leadership style, is going to be that trusted advisor, that trusted navigator. So really establishing that relationship of trust with your employees is very important. Also making sure that you're able to articulate and demonstrate a clear goal and vision for your department or your company. Really allowing your direct reports to see a little bit more about how do they play into that? What is my purpose for coming to work, right? There's a lot to be said on, and we'll talk about this later in a few slides, but employees really wanting to feel that they have a sense of purpose in the work they're doing. And of course, once they feel that they can buy into that purpose a little bit more, obviously it contributes to a little bit more of that higher productivity. So being able to clearly communicate and articulate those goals and vision is going to be important. Coming right next into, again, that strong communication. Often we just kind of think of communication as the idea of, well, I'm telling you something. I'm verbally or in writing sharing information. But communication goes so far beyond that. We have to not only think about, what we're sharing, but the why behind we're sharing, or the what we're asking somebody to do and the why behind why we're asking them to do it. Again, that kind of ties into that purpose and how are we thinking about tailoring our messages to different people with the different ways that individuals process and receive information. Really making sure that it's not a one size fits all approach that we have to our communication styles. Um, Trust and respect, this kind of again goes along back with what I was saying about the trusted leadership at the top, but really honing in on that idea of respect. Again, knowing that if somebody feels that they can be open with their supervisor and their supervisor is transparent and open with them, that's going to allow that relationship to flourish a little bit more and develop that mutual respect that is going to make it a little bit easier and flow a little bit more nicely. So that way, at when times get hard, there's going to be that relationship to know, what, my supervisor is doing this for a reason. I fully trust in their guidance and leadership. I respect that decision. I might not agree with it, but I do have to respect it because it aligns with, again, these larger goals or visions or what we as a department need to accomplish. Also thinking a little bit more about the defined roles and responsibilities. We've all probably been in positions at some point in our lives as employees ourselves and thinking a little bit more about like, what am I doing? Like, is this, I don't see how this is important. Like, how am I, contributing to a bigger picture? Um, or why do we feel like we're doubling efforts? This is my job, not their job. And I think to try and, eliminate some of that negativity from creeping in with employees or kind of feeling a little bit jaded in the work they're doing, really being able to communicate individuals' defined roles and responsibilities and how each person contributes to the larger aspect of the team or company is really important for the leader to do. And sometimes we get so focused on just managing the tasks that go behind that, but really thinking a little bit more about why is each person doing that is helpful. All of this kind of feeds into that idea of collaboration and support, which we're going to get a little bit more into in a few slides, as well as recognition and motivation, which again, we'll talk about a little bit more in a little bit as well. So some things to think first about is like, why is all of this important, right? Why do we need to have all those elements in play? And really what that boils down to is that idea of how all of this impacts the idea of performance management for your employees, and obviously how your performance management is going to drive your productivity and your outcomes. So first, we really need to kind of think about the idea of setting those performance expectations. How is performance going to be measured? What does performance look like? What is expected? This could be everything from the idea of like, what are your work hours, your time management strategies? This could also be a little bit more about how you encourage your employees to get a little bit more creative and give them a little bit more autonomy in the work that they're doing. Have them, is their performance just to do what is asked, or is their performance expected to be creative and think more and present ideas to you, right? That idea of, again, coming back to that strong communication, we as leaders need to understand that employees aren't going to be mind readers, right? And so it really, that their performance is really going to be dictated by how well we're communicating them, what's expected of them. Delivering and soliciting feedback, really that and in the middle here is the most important, because as supervisors, we all know it's our responsibilities at some point to deliver those constructive criticisms and share wins and areas of improvement, but it's also important for us to recognize the idea of we should be providing our employees an opportunity to give us feedback as well, right? Yes, we are the supervisors, but we're also employees ourselves, right? And there's always room for development with us as well. And who better to get some of that constructive feedback from than maybe from our employees directly, to think a little bit more about like, I've been working under this leadership style so far, but maybe I need to change this. Maybe what I think is the direction we should be going in, or what's best, maybe there can be some room for compromise and tweak a little bit. Also thinking a little bit more about performance evaluations, right? So we kind of talk about how that's measuring those expectations. But the next slide will talk about how this isn't just a kind of one-time thing that happens on a piece of paper. And also sometimes the negative side of the job is having those disciplinary actions and having to, understand that, there's certain steps and procedures involved with that idea of, when performance is being managed, how do we handle that? What do we do? So one thing that's really important is that we need to understand that the idea of process management is a it's a ongoing process. It's not a singular event. So to really think about how are we making these teams super high performing, well, that starts with us, right? And how we're carrying out these performance management processes. So you can kind of see it's just an ongoing circle of events that can start at the beginning of each year, calendar year, fiscal year, however your company operates, and even at the start of employment, really. So really at the start of, again, year or employment, you really want to set those expectations and goals. We talked a little bit already about the importance of reviewing those roles and responsibilities, but also like really starting the on the right foot by creating a positive impression of the evaluation process. So many times I think, individuals can think of, especially, we work in a college setting. We also have to think sometimes that maybe I know not everybody on the call works in college settings, but maybe some of you have new interns or you have, college students that are coming to work for you. And for some cases, if some people you're supervising, this might be their first job, and they might think of the idea of an evaluation process or feedback as being negative, right? So if we really think about that idea of creating a positive impression of that evaluation process, it's going to get the employee more engaged and involved in it, and almost in some ways excited to get that feedback, right? Talking about the idea still in this beginning process of how and when performance will be measured, what does success look like, great conversations to have, and really making sure that you're discussing what your communication styles and preferences are. So really thinking about the idea of, hey, this one employee might like to have ongoing communication and constantly strive for feedback and acknowledgement, where this other employee might be a little bit more reserved and they tend to be a little hesitant when I approach them with things because it interrupts their thought process or flow. So really making sure that you're tailoring those communication styles and preferences with your each individual unique employees, establishing what that will be from the beginning is going to be super helpful. Then you kind of get to this ongoing feedback area where you kind of see straddling the kind of midpoint ways of the various years. So with that ongoing feedback, what you really want to make sure is that most importantly, your feedback is timely and specific. I have a great slide coming up in just a second that's going to give you a great example of how you can make that timely and specific. But again, it should be specific and not something that occurred, something that happened 3 weeks ago that you're just talking about now. To really help get that engagement and really have it set in with the individuals who are involved, it really kind of needs to be more in that moment. Again, that timely and specific feedback will also help to build that trust that we talked about, showing that, hey, I'm receptive to the feedback you want to share with me as an employee, but also know that I'm going to be watching out for you and I'm going to be making sure that, we're both performing to the best that we can be. And I know you can do it and I want to see you do it, or hey, you're doing a great job, keep doing more of it. Giving them that, right on the moment is going to build up that trust and allow for a little bit more open communication and dialogue. And that's ultimately going to make your employee happier. It's going to boost their morale. It's going to make them feel more involved, which is great. Those ongoing conversations also help provide an opportunity to course correct. So if you started off with one particular goal or style and you're like, this isn't working, you can have that open dialogue of like, how are we going to tweak this? Something is still not setting right. What else can we try to do a little bit differently? Then obviously we'll come into the standard mid-year evaluations that I'm sure most of us are accustomed to. This is real, it's really but more of a measurement and assessment compared to that ongoing feedback, which is just like more of a dialogue and conversation. This is where you're going to have more of that formal kind of assessment and measurement of where are we based off of where were we hoping to be. How can we further tweak these strategies to develop a new cadence of communication or bring in some outside resources or internal resources that might be needed? And are we on track to meet the goals that we have set? Do we need to tweak those in another way? Is this too big of a goal? Was this too little of a goal? So this is where you can really take a look at what's been done to date to think a little bit more about how can we reprioritize or align better for what's to come. And then lastly, this end of year evaluation, really, this is where you're going to have those final year end, reviews um, of accomplishments, contributions, maybe assessing what didn't work so well. I am a firm believer that any evaluation that you get, be it mid-year or end of year, should never come as a surprise to the employee. So as supervisors, it's really important to make sure that if our employees are seeming surprised by some of the things that we're talking about during more of these formal evaluation processes, then we lacked something in those kind of ongoing feedback areas. Because really, this should never be a surprise. This should be something like, yep, we're coming to the table. We're prepared to like sit down and say, yep, here's what it was. What strategies are we going to do to fix this moving forward? So this is a slide that I was just talking about in the aspect of a good strategy to think about how do I provide that specific and timely feedback. So the SBI feedback method is something that kind of brings in this three-step approach to make sure that your feedback that you're sharing is situational, that it's behavioral, and it's impactful. So really, whatever feedback you are sharing with your employees should be able to incorporate these three elements into the process. So the situation is, when you're sharing information, be specific. When did this occur? What specific thing happened? With your behaviors, like what behaviors were observed? We can't just assume that somebody's going to say that they came across angry or they came across annoyed, right? So we have to be specific on that behavior. And then lastly, the impact. So what was the thought or feeling that was left as a result of this individual's behavior? So you can kind of see here we have two examples of how the SBI feedback method can be utilized in both a positive feedback scenario as well as a negative feedback scenario. So, great job delivering your update in our team meeting just now. That's the situation. We could actually get the person back in that environment where they were. I enjoyed the presentation slides you created as they were easy to understand and had helpful statistics. So that behavior that made me feel like I wasn't falling behind, that I wasn't misunderstanding information. I felt anybody could understand it. I'm looking forward to partnering with you next month on the presentation. So this is the impact. Now you're seeing that, hey, more people want to work with me. Like, this is great. I'm doing a fantastic job. You can see how it can uplift that morale. The negative behavior example here, when you came in late today, that being the specific situation, the way that you took your frustrations out on your coworkers, raising your voice and telling them to leave you alone, wasn't acceptable. So that's the kind of the behavior, like I'm banging on my fists or I'm making mean faces or saying rude comments to people. And then, some of your coworkers have voiced feeling uncomfortable working around you now as a result. So that's kind of the impact on how this could negatively affect a team and productivity. So having, that situation, behavior, and impact in each of the feedback dialogues that you provide can help your employee resonate with it a little bit more. That kind of comes into the idea of like, how do we get comfortable with the idea of delivering that difficult conversation? We all know, we all love providing great feedback. We all feel super enjoyable in the jobs that we have when we get to tell somebody how great they're doing. But oftentimes it's those negative conversations that people will tend to shy away from or say, maybe I'll just sweep it under the rug. Maybe this was a one-time thing. And then a one-time thing kind of snowballs into a larger thing. So the best way to kind of manage the idea of approaching difficult conversations is first really start with the idea of trying to recognize early signs of behaviors or patterns or traits that could potentially become a larger problem in the future, right? So if you notice that an employee has been late to work the past 2 days, or maybe for the past week, just kind of like checking in with them. Like if it's been 2 days in a row, on the third day being like, hey, how's it going? I saw, it's been a rough couple mornings, how are things going, right? Not directly coming at them, making them feel defensive, but just kind of trying to nip that in the bud rather than letting it go 2 weeks and then having a larger issue on the hand. I also the idea of kind of approaching with empathy, recognizing that, you know, poor behaviors or traits or signs of declining work doesn't always necessarily mean that it is an unmotivated individual or an unprofessional individual. Sometimes there could be outside influences that are affecting, their performance at work. Do they have a sick family member? Are they sick themselves? Is there something else on their mind? Maybe they're going through something personal. So really making sure that you're kind of approaching individuals and situations with empathy is going to be helpful and again, prevent that person from immediately jumping to a defensive. It's also important to make sure that the intended outcome of the conversations that we're having with our employees is focused on resolving some kind of issue or hiccup rather than assigning blame. So really making sure when you're having those conversations to avoid that verbal finger pointing, as I like to call it, right? So that really can come into play with the use of I statements versus you statements. So, approaching and saying something to the extent of, I noticed, you've been having a little trouble coming into work this week. I know that the weather has been terrible, or, I know that traffic has been bad. Is there something that I can do to kind of help support you in that aspect rather than that finger pointing and saying, you've been late to work, you need to leave your house earlier. So really think about how it comes across in our language. And then also really making sure that these conversations will have some kind of actionable outcome and setting clear expectations for what's helpful. So again, in the late to work example, yeah, I know, traffic's been horrible and the weather's been a little bit nasty. I looked at the forecast this morning and I do see that, we're preparing for another winter storm. Is there something that we can, work together on to try and figure out how we might be able to best support you in the work coming up? Or, I'd really like to make sure that if you can't make it to work on time, that you can maybe stay a little bit later to make up those hours that you're missing in the morning. So whatever those actionable outcomes are going to be. So now we're going to talk about how all of this really kind of flows into that idea of now keeping your employees engaged and therefore creating a more productive work environment. These are just some statistics that I was able to pull from a bunch of various different sources from a great article that Forbes posted. And it really kind of showcases the importance of that employee engagement and really joy that they have in the work they're doing. So companies with highly engaged employees are 21% more profitable and 17% more productive. So, when you think about, SLAs that you might have to meet or shareholders you have to make happy or just company goals, really making sure that if you want to drive up those profits or you want to show those production levels, getting your employees in on that. It starts from the ground up, right? There's not going to be any profits without sales, and you need the people to do the sales, right? And happy people are going to make the sales. If somebody came knocking on my door and said, "Yeah, I'm selling solar panels, and I don't like my job," I'm not going to buy from them, right? But if somebody does a great pitch, I'm going to be all in on that. Employees who don't receive recognition are 2 times more likely to look for a new job. So this just goes to show you the idea that, employees are craving that recognition, from an early onset of being a human being. We've all craved some form of recognition, whether that's being an infant crying for attention, whether that is, seeking, likes and hearts on social media, or even thinking about like high schoolers in athletic games, excuse me, looking to get that crowd applause. We all want that recognition. So it just goes to say that, people are going to want that in their job too. Otherwise, they're going to start thinking about, where can I get that from? 30% of employees say recognition is important, and the desire for recognition beat out having more autonomy and getting a raise. So hands down, people were saying, yeah, we want you to see us. We want to know that we're being seen. And I'll take that over I'll take that over the idea of getting more money. Getting more money is great, but in some cases there's some people that just get more money every year because it's, we're going to get a cost of living raise, or it's, built into my contract. But they also want to know that the work that they're doing to maybe earn the money or what percentage of money they're earning is recognized as well. And then it costs about 33% of an employee's salary to replace them. So just let that set in for a moment, is the idea of, we say, well, I can backfill a position, not a problem. But when you really think about it, 33% of an employee's salary to replace them, it's a good chunk of change. So, is it worth more time and energy to invest in them or versus to maybe let them go and then have to replace them? There's this great meme that exists that goes around the internet. I've seen it a bunch of different ways, but it's two people talking with each other, and it's one person walking up to what we believe to be a supervisor based off of the desk that they're sitting behind. And the supervisor says, "What happens if we invest money in them and they leave?" And then the other person says, "Well, what happens if we don't and they stay?" And that's a really great thing to think about because when you're trying to come down to those dollars and cents, long-term wise, it is going to make more sense to invest in your employees. You are going to be more profitable. You're not going to be spending as much money on that idea of replacing them or having, losing money because you have an unhappy employee staying. So the way that you can also think a little bit more about like how do I build these environments is thinking a little bit more about what motivates your employees. So really there's two main types of motivations that we as humans crave. There's those extrinsic motivations and those intrinsic motivations, right? Those intrinsic ones are those ones that, personally fulfill us. They motivate us. They drive us from a personal fulfillment perspective. And the extrinsic is really more of the like external rewards, like the platforms, the trophies, right? Um, Not to say one is better than the other. We're all made up of both of these. And that's why you kind of see here with this diagram that motivation is really at the heart of the two of these combined. So as a supervisor, kind of ask yourself a little bit more, like, what are some ways that I can actually motivate my employees? What are my employees looking for? Get to know your employees on an individual level and try to figure out a little bit more. Are they driven more intrinsically or extrinsically? Like, what type of individual are they? Because that can be a really helpful strategy in thinking a little bit more about one, not only developing your own leadership style, but how you're going to keep that cohesive team environment. These are just some really easy strategies that you can start to incorporate a little bit more into um, those motivational perks that you might offer. Some monetary based, some non-monetary based, depending upon if you have a budget, if you don't have a budget, what that budget is. Non-monetary can really come from the idea of like maybe having a champions team and just celebrating those that really align with the mission and vision of your team or your company. Having appreciation walls. And that could just be something as simple as like a cork board with like scrap pieces of paper next to it and thumbtacks that you encourage all your employees to write notes on and tack up and making sure that you also are writing notes on there and tacking it up for everybody to see. And not underestimating the idea of a good old-fashioned handwritten note. If a supervisor provided me with a handwritten note that said, "Hey, thanks so much for the great," even if it was just on a little sticky note, doesn't have to be in the form of a formal card, but that's something that's going to say they really took their time out of their day to write this for me, and that's important to me. You can't see here, but on my wall here, I have a whole bunch of just like little sticky notes and cards of, thank you notes that people have written to me that I keep up there. One, because it makes me feel good to look at that, but also two, if I'm having a rough day at work, I can just look up at some of these and I can be reminded of, I am doing good work. This is as me as an employee, today is just an off day. Here's how good I am. So it's not only just the idea of recognizing somebody one time, but how that can have a lasting impact on your employee. Also thinking about the idea of like putting shout outs and accomplishments in maybe any newsletters that you might weekly or monthly newsletters that might be sent out, or even the idea of doing team shout outs at the start of a team meeting. We all have lots of team meetings, right? Or just meetings in general. It takes 2 minutes just to do a quick shout out to say, "Hey, really impressed with, Sally today for that presentation that was delivered to, our internal partners on Monday. Great job." Something simple and so easy can go a long way. There's also the idea too of those monetary strategies. So obviously anniversary and milestone tokens, like for a 5-year, 10-year, pens, desk plaques, whatever. Customer feedback bucks. So depending upon the type of business you're in, I know there are some companies that will say, hey, for, every 2 compliment calls our customer gets, they get, or our employee gets, they get, 5 employee bucks that they can go and spend on internal office, swag or something, like from the company store or whatever. Providing team breakfasts or lunch, just bringing in a couple dozen donuts one morning, or saying, hey, we're going to bring in a deli platter for lunch for everybody today. Obviously incentive plans and peer awards, letting them feel like, hey, I can nominate my peer for a $5 Dunkin' card or something, and these will be reviewed on a monthly basis and then awarded as, a review team sees fit. So lots of different strategies, and I'm sure there could be even more, but just to kind of get your thoughts thinking of like, how can I really motivate my employees by just showing them that we appreciate them? And I'm going to turn it back over to Erin.
Okay, great. Yep. So as we kind of wrap up this this discussion, let's talk about some action steps that you could consider after today. So start by reflecting on what your current strengths are. Are there skills that you're looking to improve as a supervisor? And what areas are there for growth? Self-reflection is great. It's really helpful. What can be even more helpful is soliciting feedback from other people. So a lot of organizations use 360 feedback, ask if finding out from your employees, what is it that I do well? What are things that I could improve? And this helps create a culture of open communication. And the more open communication you have, obviously, the more buy-in you'll get as a leader, and conducting routine check-ins to kind of get the pulse of how things are going, both as a leader and for the development of employees. So, every good leader will search for professional development opportunities to just further improve. And, welcome to a professional development opportunity for you right here, offered by UConn. So take advantage of these. I think, even if you just walk away with one little nugget, it's a worthwhile endeavor. Something that can be really helpful, and especially for myself, I do this all the time, is developing goals and then having somebody, and in my case, it's my direct supervisor, to hold me accountable for those goals. So I regularly check in with my supervisor around specific goals that I have for my own professional development and leadership qualities. And getting some feedback on that has always been really helpful for me in my own development. So I would encourage you to do the same if you're not already. So that kind of wraps it up for today. If anybody has any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat.
While we wait for some folks to put some questions in, do have a couple that we can start with, if that sounds good. And folks, please definitely utilize the Q&A. How can a supervisor determine which leadership style is most effective for their team?
So yeah, I'd say, when you're thinking about that, you have to think about a couple different, I can't think of the word I'm looking for, a couple different outside influences. So first you have to think about, what is your team dynamic? What type of individuals do you have? Do you have a team that is just filled with all go-getters? Do you have a team that is filled of more introverted individuals? Or is it a mix of both? You also have to think a little bit more about, what am I going to be comfortable with as a supervisor, right? So it's kind of got to be a unique balance. It's not always necessarily going to be a one size fits all approach, but you kind of have to think a little bit more about, how can I maybe even blend some styles if needed, right? It's not a matter of, I'm a democratic leader or a bureaucratic leader, or I'm a transitional leader. Sometimes you might find that your style is blending of the two, just based off of who you have on your team and really kind of what your company will, or your organization will allow.
Wonderful, thank you. And kind of building off that in different personalities and working styles that might exist within a team, like what steps can a leader take to build trust within their team?
for me and working with the teams that I supervise and work with, I'm pretty transparent about my leadership style right off the bat. And getting the pulse of, is that going to work for you? Is there something that I need to do to adapt to make you more successful? My leadership style personally has changed over the years quite a bit. But I'm fortunate to have team members that I've had for a long time, so we know each other really well, and we know how each other work. But it can be particularly challenging with a new employee and kind of feeling that out and making adjustments along the way. So I think it's just about continually reflecting on your style, on the styles of others, and if it's a good fit for the organization and the mission in general.
Wonderful, thank you. We do have a question that came in from the chat. I noticed some leaders talk about me versus us. Do you have an opinion which is more effective, or does it come down to leadership style?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think if I'm understanding the question correctly, I would have to say this is where it's going to come down to what are those goals? You know, as I said earlier in the presentation, like we as leaders, we're employees ourselves too. So we're in a very unique position where we do have to think a little bit more from the me perspective because well, I am trying to lead my employees and get them to meet the results they need to. I also know that I need to meet my results to share up to my supervisor. Um, but I think when it's more about the me versus us, I also, me personally as a leader, I believe that, if I'm part of a team, we win as a team, we fail as a team. So, I think that's where I, I don't think it's necessarily something that's so black and white. I think there needs to be a little bit of give and take to understand that some moments it's going to be more of me, and some moments it is going to be more us, and that us could be our immediate team, that us could be us as the larger company or larger group of leaders down to employees. Um, but again, I think that's where it's going to come down to if you have that open communication and that relationship with your employees, they're going to if they trust you and they're along for the ride with you, it's not going to matter if it's a me or us thing because they're going to know that whatever it is at that particular moment that they can trust you that you're leading it in the right direction.
Wonderful, thank you. Keep those questions coming in, folks. And you had kind of touched on this a little bit, but how can managers provide constructive feedback without discouraging employees?
I mean, I think constructive feedback can be quite encouraging if done correctly. You know, I always preface conversations with, with about it being a growth opportunity. If I weren't giving my team constructive feedback, I'd be doing them a disservice, I think, as I think everybody wants to grow professionally. And approaching these conversations with empathy, I think, goes a really long way. We all make mistakes and we all looking to grow. And, I look back even on my own professional growth and development thus far, and my biggest moments were when I received constructive criticism. And I remember those things for a very long time. And I still remember some early constructive criticism that has helped me along the way. So I just try to remind myself of that, even though those conversations can be kind of tricky and difficult to navigate. You can learn a lot by having those conversations with employees, and they can take a lot away from that as well.
Thank you. An additional question we have is how can leaders navigate difficult conversations without creating conflict?
Yeah, so I think that's a great one to think a little bit more about circling back to something I said before about that verbal finger pointing, right? I think conflict itself is something that is derived when there are two opposing parties that feel that they have to be in a situation to defend a thought or a feeling or something along those lines. And so really the idea of having those conversations without that idea of conflict is making sure that there is never one party that feels they're right, they're wrong, that they need to be on the defensive. So again, I know we've said this quite a bit, but it bears repeating is really that idea of empathy. And so when you're thinking about navigating those conversations, try to make it a two-way conversation, right? Oftentimes, an employee, especially if it's like a disciplinary conversation, an employee will come in and think, oh, I'm in the hot seat and I'm just going to get in trouble. And sometimes the supervisor could also think, all right, well, this is just something I've got to nip in the bud and tell them to, to stop doing it. But I think if we approach that a little bit more with empathy and we look at the idea of actually talking with each other as human beings and having two-way conversations, right? Um, and kind of stepping out of the moments of our roles, right? We each need to be roles, but kind of taking off those like stereotypical ideas that are assigned to each of those roles and saying, well, let's think about things. Let's talk about things. Why do you feel this way? Here's why I feel this way. What is a good approach to kind of thinking about how are we going to mediate this hiccup or this hurdle that we're currently facing? I think that's really a great way to kind of approach that and avoid that conflict. It really comes down to that idea of healthy mediation and resolve rather than any kind of feeling that there's a defensive mechanism that needs to be deployed.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, we don't have any other additional questions at this time. Certainly, if you have any last minute ones, put them in the chat. I wanted to see if Kristen and Aaron, if you had any kind of last words on this wonderful conversation that we've had here today.
No, I'll just say that, and Aaron touched upon this earlier with himself, is that, our leadership styles are something that are going to evolve over time. They're going to evolve as we look at ourselves as the employee and we think about how, what's the development strategy we have for us and who we are as a person and where we are in our careers and where we want to go and, what's gonna motivate us and fulfill us, right? And that could be, through various professional developments that we attend, or other just outlooks we have on life. So I think it's just really kind of important to recognize that while you may be at a certain point today, that could be different in a week from now, a month from now, 5 years from now. And as leaders, we want to make sure that we keep evolving because we know our teams are going to evolve. And I think that as long as we can make a commitment to ourselves to evolve with that, we can make sure that we're always kind of creating a healthy team.
Yeah. We did have one question trickle in if we want to tackle it. When using the SBI method, is there a way to approach negative behavior that you hear about versus witnessing?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Um, you know, and I think this comes with, any kind of just like, one-off thoughts or 360 feedback that's shared in, helping determine evaluations. We kind of have to look at two factors. We have to think about the idea of the person with who the evaluation is for, and then we also kind of have to think a little bit, this is going to sound wrong, but I don't mean it to sound wrong, about where that evaluation is coming from. So, for example, if we know that we have an individual that's a top performer and always has that smile on their face and is always the first to, say good morning to people when they walk in the office, and we get a one-off comment that says, this person is the rudest person ever. We kind of have to take that into consideration a little bit because yes, it's something that breaks against the individual's personality and it kind of makes us wonder, did this, is this a one-off thing? What's happening? But then also like, if this was in a call center, long time ago in my career, I worked in call centers. And we'd have to take into account the caller and right, is this a caller that our notes indicate that they always have complaints about the product or something from, right? So I think we kind of have to take that into a little bit of consideration when thinking about that SBI method. As far as how that relates again to more of that observed versus hearsay, for lack of a better term. If it's something significant where it was something completely inappropriate, that's where with the SBI, I think in that case, you have to think about how you're delivering that situation and say, well, I did not specifically observe this. There was an instance where one of your teammates or one of our customers felt that your specific, and we kind of still need to be a little bit more specific on that. And this behavior rubbed them the wrong way, and that could be the way that you helped them. So I think there does still need to be that situational behavior and the impact to the individual. But I think we need to be very transparent and observed. We also need to be careful that so much of our feedback to employees is not solely focused on the hearsay, because obviously there's something to be said as a manager where, if we're observing our employees enough, we come to know them and what they're capable of doing. And so I think that would also, determine is this a full feedback, or is this just more of a, hey, just want to let you know this arose, no big deal, but just something you might want to keep an eye on for the future. So
Thank
hopefully
you.
that answers the question.
No, that was a very thoughtful answer. Thank you. With no more questions, I do want to thank you both, Kristen and Aaron, for your time and your expertise here today. This has been a wonderful and important conversation that we're having. And I want to thank everyone who joined this webinar. Thank you for attending. Certainly, please be sure to check out uconnalumni.com/events for UConn alumni happenings coming up in your area. But thank you to everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.